In the early morning of June 6, 1944, as part of the first wave, paratroopers of the 101st Airborne Division jumped from airplanes and gliders into German-occupied France. Specifically, they landed behind the shores of Utah Beach in the interior of the Carentan Peninsula. Approximately 6,670 paratroopers from the 101st Airborne Division launched from 7 different airfields in England and led the nighttime drop alongside the 82nd Airborne Division. The soldiers wore blackface for camouflage, their heads were shaved, and their bodies were loaded with approximately 57 kilograms of weapons, ammunition, and equipment. On their left shoulders, they proudly wore the black, yellow, and white emblem of their division, known as the Screaming Eagle. General Eisenhower, accompanied by Brigadier General Maxwell Davenport Taylor, commander of the aforementioned division, toured the airfields in a jeep, personally bidding farewell and wishing good luck to as many men as he could. Others received messages over the plane's loudspeakers. The pilots of the Air Force's 9th Troop Carrier Squadron revved their engines. The large planes shook and their propellers vibrated, then began to taxi slowly toward the runways. As the last light faded in the western sky, the Allied naval planes lifted off, fell into formation, and headed toward the French coast. More than 490 troop carrier planes were airborne. Each plane carried a group of paratroopers, varying in number but averaging 14 per group. Each plane carried equipment packs that were ejected through the door before the jump. Most planes also had ammunition and equipment strapped to their exteriors, which were dropped over the drop zones. In one Douglas AC-47 was Division Commander Maxwell Taylor, and in another was Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe, the division artillery commander. The primary mission of the 101st Airborne Division was to clear the way for the U.S. 4th Infantry Division, which landed at dawn on D-Day on Utah Beach according to invasion plans. The nature of the beach area dictated the various missions of the division's regiments. Extending inland for about a mile was a strip of marshland. Dirt tracks topped by paved roads had been built across the marshland, and these provided the only convenient exits from the beach area to the mainland west of the marsh. Just west of the village of Saint-Martin-de-Varaville stood a 4-gun German coastal battery that posed an ominous threat to the Utah Beach landings. The men of the 502nd Regiment were tasked with destroying the coastal battery and nearby artillery garrison, establishing checkpoints to the north at Foucaultville to prevent German reinforcements from reaching the beach area, and finally capturing the roads into the area and securing them for infantry. The 506th Regiment, located on the division's extreme left, was to secure that flank against enemy attack and serve as a liaison between its parent unit, the 6th Corps, and the neighboring 5th Corps advancing from Omaha Beach. The remaining parachute regiment, the 501st, was given the mission of capturing the La Barquette locks and destroying the railroad bridge and 4 highway bridges northwest of Carentan. The destruction of the bridges was vital to preventing German reinforcements from entering the Utah Beach area. That night of June 5, 1944, the German ground forces were not on high alert. They too had seen the weather reports and had ruled out the possibility of an invasion until later in the month. In fact, Field Marshal Rommel had gone home on leave the day before. Several other senior German commanders had left their posts and departed for Rennes for a war game exercise. In Saint-Lô, General Erich Marx's midnight birthday party was beginning. Instead of flying the 101st Airborne Division directly to its drop zones in Normandy, a circular route was designed. The Allied air train was to leave England in a wide arc, head for the Channel Islands of Guernsey and Jersey, then make a nearly 90-degree turn to the left, reach the French coast on the west side of the Cherbourg Peninsula, drop the troops, and then continue to complete the circle over the Channel and return to England. Meanwhile, on the ground in occupied France, just minutes away from the soldiers, events were already unfolding. The lead troops had gone into action shortly after midnight. A group of about 120 American volunteer paratroopers, under the command of Captain Frank Lilliman, had begun descending on the Carentan area. Not everything had gone well. The paratroopers encountered fog and then German anti-aircraft fire. Some planes broke formation, lost their bearings, and dropped their men miles from their intended drop zones. One plane was forced to land in the English Channel, but at 12:15 a.m., Assault Leader Lilliman launched into space, becoming the first American soldier to land on occupied French soil. Lilliman and his group of 18 men were dropped in a field near Saint-Germain-de-Varreville, approximately 2.5 kilometers from their objective. The C-47s flew at 1,500 feet, 457 meters, to avoid small arms fire from the ground. But it wasn't small arms fire they encountered, nor what they had to fear. German anti-aircraft guns along the coast opened fire with all their might. Huge beams of light probed the sky, located the transports and pinned them down like helpless moths. Flares and rockets exploded in and around the formations, lighting up the night in a terrible and deadly display. The heavy guns opened fire. Bursts of anti-aircraft fire sent lethal shards of steel through the transport's fragile decks. Thousands of machine gun tracers seared red and orange patterns in the darkness, piercing the wings and fuselages of the planes and all too often the bodies of the helpless soldiers. The C-47s rocked and shuddered under the tremendous impact of the explosions. The soldiers, their faces haggard, stood up and hooked up their parachutes. The months and months of training and waiting were over. Outside below, there was an enemy trying to finish them off. The soldiers wanted out. They needed to keep their feet on the ground and weapons in hand to defend themselves. Just minutes after reaching the target areas, many of the C-47 pilots began to panic. They had never before experienced anything so terrifying. Although they had orders not to take any evasive action, so as not to draw the soldiers away from their objective, the pilots initiated violent maneuvers to avoid the deadly attack fire. Some turned around, others climbed higher, others descended almost to tree-line level. The maneuvering aircraft forced others out of formation. Many disintegrated and scattered haphazardly across the peninsula. The soldiers, crammed into the planes, had no way of knowing what was happening. Some, standing in aircraft with their doors removed, could see the ghastly light in the sky around them. They even perceived a strange, haunting and terrifying beauty in the deadly fireworks display. But the beauty was soon lost when a soldier was hit and screamed in pain or collapsed. Some pilots, hopelessly lost, accidentally dropped their men into the channel. Weighed down by equipment, the men drowned. Other pilots, jumping from side to side to avoid anti-aircraft fire, dropped their men from only 60 or 90 meters. The soldiers in these planes hit the ground and died before their parachutes had a chance to open. The men were dropped randomly into streams, swamps, fields and gardens, and into the middle of villages. They landed on trees and rooftops. Some were dropped right into the middle of German troop formations. Some 1,500 men of the 101st Division were dropped completely outside the 8-square-mile designated drop zone. Even the 2 airborne divisions were mixed up. Some paratroopers from the 82nd Airborne Division, directed north and west around the key town of Saint-Côme-du-Mont, landed in 101st Division territory, and some from the 101st landed in the 82nd Division's drop zone. In the darkness, in the confusion, it quickly seemed as if Normandy had been invaded by a plague of crickets. Soldiers frantically signaled with their metal toys, searching for their comrades and officers. Men began to gather in small groups among the dense hedges, in the deep ditches. Small battles began to break out as soldiers encountered German patrols. By now, the Wehrmacht had been alerted to the drop. German field commanders were still unaware of the paratroopers' purpose. They couldn't tell if the airdrop was a diversion, a commando attack, or if it was, in fact, the prelude to a full-scale seaborne invasion. The American paratroopers were not alone in their confusion. The dispersal of the 101st and 82nd Airborne Divisions across the landscape caused sheer chaos in the German ranks. Wehrmacht officers on the scene desperately tried to make sense of the situation. Their maps were riddled with marks of supposed parachute drops. The Americans seemed to be everywhere, as indeed they were. Attacks came from all directions at once, but for the German commanders no plan seemed to be developing. Despite their dispersion, despite the lack of control, the Screaming Eagles rallied and moved forward. The unique individuality of the American soldier soon prevailed in aggressive action. The soldiers knew what they were there for and what they had to do. The 101st Division's paratroopers deployment zone included German forces from the 709th Static Infantry Division and the 91st Airborne Division. These units were not as highly trained and were composed of battalions from the east. These were a mix of volunteers, conscripts, and former Soviet prisoners of war who had chosen to fight in the German army rather than suffer the harsh conditions of prisoners of war. First and foremost, it was with these units that the 101st Division's paratroopers faced off. By dawn on June 6th, a substantial part of the 101st Division's mission had been accomplished. The 4 causeways leading from Utah Beach were secured. Men, tanks, and equipment were advancing along these causeways inland. The German coastal battery and artillery barracks had been destroyed. Roadblocks had been established outside Forcarville to secure the division's right flank and prevent enemy reinforcements from advancing south toward the invasion beaches. However, there was still much fighting to be done. Advance towards Carentan, the 101st Airborne Division. The 3rd Battalion, 506th Regiment, whose mission was to seize the 2 wooden bridges over the Douve, was thrown into a hornet's nest. Their area was one of the few points in Normandy where the Germans had anticipated a paratroop attack. The fields were surrounded by mortar and machine gun fire. As the first soldiers began to fall, the Germans set fire to a house, illuminating the entire area. 20 soldiers died before they reached the ground. The battalion commander, Lieutenant Colonel Robert Wolverton, his executive officer, and one of the company commanders were killed in the ambush. The other company commanders were immediately captured. By the evening of the following day, as the 506th Regiment dug in around Beaumont, General Taylor knew that his men must at all costs fight their way through Saint-Côme-du-Mont, secure the road to Carentan, if possible the crossings, and finally take Carentan. This mission was of utmost urgency, as the Germans already knew what was happening on the Normandy front and understood the importance of Carentan and the bridge crossings. It was more than simply controlling roads and bridges for armored vehicles. Carentan now stood as the key to consolidating the American forces. It lay on the left flank of the 101st Regiment, dividing the units that had landed on Utah Beach from those that had landed on Omaha Beach. Field Marshal Rommel, returning from Germany, located the town of Carentan on his situation map. He intended to hold that position and use it as a springboard for a counterattack that could split the 2 American Army Corps back to the beaches. He issued the order of the day to the German 6th Parachute Regiment, which was holding the town. Carentan will be defended to the last man. The 101st's attack on the morning of June 8th began with a continuous artillery barrage lasting over an hour. Some 2,500 105mm shells rained down on the German positions. A 3-pronged advance then began behind the artillery, one directly up the road to Saint-Côme-du-Mont, coordinated with a double envelopment by the 501st and 327th Regiments behind the town. By 8 a.m. that morning, Colonel Ewell and his 3rd Battalion, the 101st, had penetrated the German positions. He decided to advance, although the 506th, on his right flank, was bogged down. But his troops encountered intense artillery fire from Carentan and machine gun fire from the buildings on the first bridge. As his men formed skirmish lines to return fire, they were hit from the rear by German paratroopers. The battalion wheeled around to meet the attack. Time and again, the Germans charged the American lines. Each time the attack was repulsed, the Germans came closer and closer to breaking through. During the afternoon, the situation became precarious for Ewell's battalion. His men began to buckle slightly under the tremendous pressure of the constant German attacks. Caught in a brutal crossfire, the Germans withdrew, leaving their dead and wounded behind. At least for the time being, the pressure was relieved. 6 times that day, the Germans counterattacked the 3rd Battalion, and all 6 times were repulsed. The battalion lost 25% of its men killed and wounded, but held its hard-won ground. Finally, the Germans gave up the fight. They withdrew from Saint-Côme-du-Mont, but not before blowing up the bridge that spanned the causeway to Carentan. Since blowing up these bridges was part of the 101st Division's mission, it seemed the Germans had already accomplished part of their task. But the situation had suddenly reversed. General Taylor preferred his forces to capture the Carentan bridges intact for use by the advancing American forces. However, the Germans realized they had missed their golden opportunity for a large-scale armored attack from Carentan. But it was still a crucial crossroads town. Therefore, as a defensive maneuver, it was best to destroy the bridges. And yet, to General Taylor's pleasant surprise, the Germans only destroyed the 2nd bridge. This turned out to be a mixed blessing, as the men of the 101st Division would soon discover. From the new positions below Saint-Côme-du-Mont, to the town of Carentan, the paved road crossed approximately a mile of swamp. The road rose on a shoulder, some 6 or 7 feet above the surface of the swamp. It became a causeway over the Douve and Jourdan rivers, which converged opposite Carentan. This entire stretch of road was exposed to small arms and artillery fire. There was no shelter. It was possible to dig a foxhole on the side of the embankment, but that was the limit of protection and concealment that could be expected. Along this road, with no other option, the 101st had to advance. After the capture of Saint-Côme-du-Mont, soldiers of the 506th established outposts all the way to the blown bridge. From their foxholes, men equipped with binoculars could see the Germans installing machine gun nests in the houses on the outskirts of town. That night, Taylor ordered the 3rd Battalion, 502nd, to advance through the 506th's positions and lead the attack on Carentan. General Taylor's plan was to encircle Carentan on 3 sides. After crossing the causeways, the 502nd was to turn below Carentan toward an objective called Hill 30, cutting off the German retreat. At the same time, the 327th Glider Regiment would attack Carentan directly from the 502nd's left flank. The 501st would attack from a direction almost opposite the 502nd, turn around at Carentan, and complete the encircling movement by rendezvousing with the 502nd on Hill 30. Carentan, the first clashes with the Waffen SS. Carentan was home to 2 battalions of the German 6th Parachute Regiment under the command of Major Friedrich von der Heydter. The remaining pieces of the 91st Infantry Division were also located there. On June 8th, parts of both divisions had withdrawn from Saint-Côme-du-Mont, 2 kilometers to the northwest, toward Carentan when paratroopers of the 101st Division captured the town. The day before, on June 7th, the 17th SS Panzergrenadier Division Götz von Berlichingen, stationed in the Thouars area, had received orders to move to Normandy. It was not yet fully equipped and was part of the German Oberkommando Reserve. The lack of transport space, constant Allied air attacks destroyed bridges over the Loire, and ultimately the destroyed rail network made its transfer to the front difficult. The advanced detachments arrived at Angers on June 9th and at Saint-Lô on June 10th. The division formed 2 battle groups with its Panzergrenadier regiments. The 37th SS Panzergrenadier Regiment was sent to Carentan, while the 38th Regiment was sent to the right bank to protect the flanks of the 17th SS Panzergrenadier Division. After securing Saint-Côme-du-Mont, the right flank was ready to attack the access dam. There were indications that Carentan should not be vigorously defended. The 506th had established outposts on the first 2 bridges, and the next day conducted a reconnaissance sortie on the outskirts of Carentan. They set fire near the 4th bridge. American aerial reconnaissance reported the evacuation of the town and that a large hole had opened in the railroad embankment, making the road the best option to reach Carentan. The access dam ran narrow and straight through the swamp, allowing the Americans to quickly detect the advancing Germans and easily defend themselves in all directions. The attack was carried out by the 502nd Regiment. Lieutenant Colonel Robert Cole set out with the 3rd Battalion shortly after midnight on June 10th. Since the engineers who were to repair Bridge No. 2 could not work under enemy fire, the attack was called off shortly afterward. Shortly afterward, a patrol was sent out to scout the road. They crossed the canal by boat at Bridge No. 2. When they attempted to continue toward Bridge No. 4, they were blocked by a large steel gate, the so-called Belgian Gate. As they attempted to open this obstacle, a mortar shell suddenly exploded next to them. At that same moment, a storm of machine gun fire and more grenades began raining down on them from German positions along the road. Although the patrol had to withdraw again around 5:30 a.m., it was now known that the Germans had not yet abandoned the defense of Carentan. The battalion was notified that the new attack date would be in the afternoon. This time, the 65th Armored Field Artillery Battalion and the 907th Glider Field Artillery Battalion would provide significant gun support. Most of the artillery fire was concentrated on known and suspected enemy positions, which were primarily southwest of Bridge No. 4. By noon, the pioneers had still not closed the large gap in Bridge No. 2. Lieutenant Colonel Cole and 3 other soldiers laid planks across the bridge so the battalion could cross one by one in the early afternoon. From the direction of Carentan, an 8.8 centimeter anti-aircraft gun repeatedly opened fire on the road, but did not stop the men. The soldiers either crouched or crawled along the dam. After 3 hours, when most of the Americans had crossed 3 bridges and were beyond bridge number 2, the Germans opened fire from protective hedges and a large farmhouse on the right. The men immediately headed for the trenches. As they attempted to advance further, a machine gun bombarded the trenches with numerous bursts. After 3 soldiers were hit, the group withdrew. In long line, the battalion advanced along the road, unable to defend itself on the right and left flanks. They were constantly under German machine gun fire. They had to pass under the Belgian gate at bridge number 4 one after another under direct fire. Without support from artillery, which bombarded the German positions beginning at 4 p.m., a portion of Company G, which led the battalion, took up positions to the right of the bridge, while the rest attempted to slip through the narrow opening. 6 soldiers managed to get through, but the 7th was hit. The action was immediately stopped and a defensive position was established. The entire battalion was now trapped. The company crouched next to the dam at bridge number 3 and was virtually exposed to German fire. They were hit hard, first by rifle fire and around 11:30 p.m., also by 2 German fighter planes, which fired on them and dropped bombs on their position. During a brief ceasefire at midnight, only 21 men and 2 officers of the company's original 80 soldiers were able to withdraw beyond bridge number 2. Around 4 a.m. on June 11th, Regimental Command ordered the 3rd Battalion to continue the attack. In the darkness, G Company and Headquarters Company advanced through the gate at Bridge 4. They straddled the road embankment. The main German position appeared to be a large farmhouse to the right of the road, surrounded by high hedges. It rose clearly from the marshland on a small hill. As the first soldiers approached the yard, they came under rifle, machine gun, and mortar fire. A concentrated American artillery barrage did little to change the situation. Therefore, Lieutenant Colonel Cole launched a bayonet attack on the German position. To do so, he had the artillery fire smoke bombs into the area. At 6:15 a.m., after the artillery fire ceased, Cole gave the whistle to attack, but of the original 250 men, only 20 followed him. Because the Americans were dispersed over a very large area, the order had not been widely disseminated. In addition, Company G made contact with the enemy and was engaged by German units with machine guns on the prairie east of the Carentan road. The commanding officer was wounded by an artillery shell that was fired too short. When the company heard Cole's whistle and saw the other Americans running toward the farmhouse, they ran after him. The men of Company H were the first to reach the farmhouse but found it deserted. Enemy fire now came from a tall hedge that ran at right angles to the road. The Americans stormed into the area and mowed down the Germans with hand grenades and bayonets. The only German resistance now lay to the south, from where the Americans were receiving constant fire. Cole actually wanted to continue the advance immediately, but the battalion no longer had the strength to do so. All the Americans assembled near the farmhouse. There it quickly became apparent that the units had become confused in the chaos of the fighting and had suffered heavy losses in some cases. Therefore, the 1st Battalion, 502nd Parachute Infantry, was ordered to continue the attack beyond the 3rd Battalion's position. Finally, faced with the prolonged American advance, the German paratroopers abandoned the town of Carentan on the afternoon of June 11th. At dawn the following day, the Americans launched the expected concentric attack on both sides of Carentan. However, the attack met with no success. During the afternoon, the Americans reached Hill 30 south of the town. Meanwhile, further south, Götz von Berlichingen's forces organized and reinforced themselves with artillery and tanks to advance and recapture Carentan as quickly as possible. The latter had eventually been taken by the American 101st Airborne Division. The main attack would be carried out by the 37th Regiment, supported by the 6th Parachute Regiment and 2 Sturmgeschütz companies. During the night, the counterattacking units took up positions at their starting points. At 5:30 a.m. on June 13th, Götz von Berlichingen's artillery bombarded the positions of the 101st Airborne Division. 15 minutes later, SS Panzer Grenadiers began their advance against the American paratroopers. These forces belonged mainly to the 37th Regiment's 1st Battalion. Behind them followed 17 Sturmgeschütz from the Panzer Battalion. From the outset, the attack gained ground without encountering resistance, but when the companies crossed the Carentan-Domville road, they were flanked by selective and fragmented fire, causing their first casualties. Most of them were caused by snipers among the trees. Fighting finally broke out in the sector. By 7:30 a.m., the 1st Battalion of the 37th Regiment had achieved a significant advance, but at the cost of heavy losses. At 9 a.m., the 1st Battalion reached the southwestern edge of Carentan, while shortly afterward, the 2nd Battalion of the 6th Parachute Regiment reached the station grounds west of the town. Until then, the Panzer Grenadier advance had only been 500 meters deep. By 9:50 a.m., the German advance had ceased. From midday, the Americans counterattacked with tanks from the 2nd Armored Division. The 37th Regiment was forced to withdraw under heavy American pressure. The counterattack continued throughout southern Carentan. Under these circumstances, the Waffen SS ordered the Germans to halt all counterattacks and withdraw to their starting lines. That same afternoon, the 2nd Battalion of the 37th SS Regiment moved along the road toward Carentan, while the 1st Battalion dug into the left of the road. The German counterattack had failed. At night, the division organized a new defensive line from south of Carentan to the marshy meadows of Gorges. By June 14, 1944, regiments of the 101st Airborne Division launched an attack along the Carentan-Perrier road, but were halted near La Malière. Fighting continued on all sides. By June 15th, all was secure. Armored vehicles and infantry drove the Germans back so far that Carentan became a rear reserve area. The Screaming Eagles established a defensive line south and southwest of the town. 2 weeks later, the 101st Division moved into a camp about 25 kilometers northwest, near Cherbourg. For the division, the Battle of Normandy was over. All missions had been accomplished. On July 7th, General Taylor called a division assembly and told his men, "Run forward toward the enemy. Show that the German soldier is not a Superman. You have beaten them on their own ground, and you can beat them on any ground." The following week, the 101st Division boarded speedboats and sailed back to England for rest. In their battle for Normandy, the Screaming Eagles had suffered 4,670 casualties. Netherlands. During the pleasant English summer of 1944, while the 101st Airborne Division was re-equipping, reorganizing and reinforcing its troops, the Allied armies swept through France and Belgium. Paris was liberated in August. The Canadian First Army had cut off all German forces along the Channel ports and had almost reached the Dutch border. The British Second Army had taken Antwerp, a vital Allied port facility. The American First Army had advanced to the edge of the Siegfried Line, Hitler's famous defense line along the German border. General Patton and his new Third Army advanced rapidly through southeastern France and had reached the Moselle River at Nancy. The Supreme Command considered the airborne operations in Normandy so successful that the First Allied Airborne Army was created. The American part of this army was called the 18th Airborne Corps and comprised the United States 17th, 82nd, and 101st Airborne Divisions. Command of the army fell to Lieutenant General Louis Brereton, commander of the U.S. 9th Air Force. During the summer of 1944, several parachute drops were planned, but the rapid advance of the Allied forces cancelled them all before they could begin. The Germans were on the loose, but far from defeated. The Allied High Command's strategy, from the very beginning of Operation Overlord, called for the invasion of Germany from the north. While Field Marshal Montgomery was confident that he could eventually drive the Germans out of Holland, the strategy demanded a rapid advance before the Germans could build a new defense line along their border with Holland. The numerous canals and rivers crisscrossing the country made it easy for the retreating Germans to implement delaying tactics. Bridges could be blown up and checkpoints established at vital crossings. Meanwhile, a solid defense was being built on the border. Thus, Operation Market Garden was born. The plan was as follows. Operation Garden would be implemented on the ground. The British 101st Corps, led by tanks from the Guards Armoured Division, was to take off from the Belgian-Dutch border and quickly head for the city of Arnhem, 107 kilometers away on the banks of the Rhine. In front of them, spreading a carpet along the only road that crossed the canals and rivers to Arnhem, the 1st Allied Airborne Army would descend from the sky and seize the bridges with a lightning-fast surprise attack, and this would be Operation Market. The single road that ran along the spine of Holland was the key to the entire operation. This road, with its villages and bridges, was the only suitable route for the armoured vehicles that had to cross the lowlands. The Allied High Command believed that, with the bridges and other strategic points in the hands of the airborne forces, the British could advance rapidly along the corridor, bypass Arnhem, and cross the Rhine to Nunspeet. This would trap all the Germans between the road and the sea and pave the way for a breakout into Germany. The program called for XXX Corps to reach Arnhem within 48 hours, since the airborne troops, falling without tanks, artillery, or resupply, would be unable to hold out any longer against the inevitable German counterattacks. The British 1st Airborne was to launch at Arnhem. To the south, where the road crossed the Waal at Nijmegen and the Meuse at Grave, the 82nd Division would launch. The 101st Division's mission was to take control of a 16-mile stretch of road that began behind the German front line at Eindhoven and extended north through the towns of Sint-Oedenrode and Veghel. Together, the Allied airborne forces, both gliders and paratroopers, numbered about 35,000 men. The mission assigned to the 101st Division was especially crucial. The Guards Division had to reach them first. If the Eagles failed to open the corridor, any action by the other divisions further north would be futile. Furthermore, even after the Guards had crossed, the Eagles were responsible for the security of their section of road. There would be Germans on both sides of the road trying to cut it off, and 16 miles of road was too much for one division to hold completely. The soldiers of the 101st Division would soon call it Hell's Highway. General Taylor understood that the only thing he could do along that 16-mile corridor was to defend the key bridges and towns and maintain contact between those points through intensive patrols. In reality, the entire operation was like a long chain, with weak links along the 64 miles of road. If at any point the Germans managed to break these weak links, the operation faced disaster. The Allied High Command counted on the element of surprise to carry out the operation. Surprise and intelligence reports indicating that the German troops in the area were poorly organized and in some cases with rear area units that would offer little resistance in actual combat. These intelligence reports were largely correct, but not entirely. Operation Market Garden was scheduled for Sunday, September 17th. At 10 a.m., some 5,000 Army airborne transports, bombers, fighters, and 2,500 gliders were scheduled to take off. The drop was to begin at 1:30 p.m. An hour later, following an artillery barrage and under the umbrella of fighter bombers, Lieutenant Colonel Joe Vandeleur's Irish Guards would launch their attack along Hell's Highway. The decision to make this daylight jump was a bold one. It was based on two factors: the confusion and dispersion of the paratroopers following the nighttime Normandy drop and Allied air superiority. Furthermore, recalling the painful experiences of Normandy, General Taylor insisted on a concentrated drop. Both the 502nd and 506th Regiments would drop northwest of the town of Sun, the same area that would later be used for glider landings. The task assigned to the 502nd was to guard the landing area, capture the road bridge at Saint-Oedenrode, defend Sun, and support the 506th in its attack on Eindhoven. The 506th Regiment was to seize the Wilhelmina Canal Bridge at Sonn, then turn south and capture Eindhoven with its 4 road bridges over the Dommel. The 501st, which had been assigned the northernmost drop zone, was tasked with capturing the road and rail bridges over the Zuid-Willemsvaart Canal at Veghel. General Taylor also assigned a small additional mission to the 502nd, to seize the road and rail bridges at Best, west of the regimental area. This was not part of the original combat area assigned to the 101st. However, upon reviewing the operational maps, General Taylor thought it would be a good idea to help secure the flank through Best. As the C-47s flew over the channel, no German fighters approached them. Near the drop zones, anti-aircraft fire began to intensify. But this wasn't Normandy. The troop carrier command pilots had learned a bitter lesson well. After Normandy, General Eisenhower had chastised them for their costly mistakes. This time there was no evasive action to avoid flak, no breaking of formation. Even as their planes burst into flames, the pilots held course for those vital seconds necessary for an accurate jump. Entire battalions descended together, landed near their equipment, and were organized and operational in less than an hour. It was a parade platform jump. The gliders that arrived an hour later weren't so lucky, as 17 of the 70 never reached the drop zone. For the residents of Veghel, who were awaiting liberation from the Germans, the sight of an entire regiment of paratroopers descending around them must have been a source of joy. Their village was the target of the 501st Regiment, commanded by Colonel Howard Johnson. They encountered nothing more serious than scattered rifle fire and the occasional burst of machine gun fire. All the bridges were captured. They then advanced toward Veghel and there met up with the scouts of the 1st Battalion. Some recalcitrant Germans put up a fight but were quickly subdued. 50 prisoners were taken. The citizens of Veghel came out of their houses and marched through the streets en masse, shouting and crying with joy. They offered food and drink to the soldiers, chatting in broken English. For a time, the war was forgotten, and the soldiers found it difficult to establish defensive positions in the town against German counterattacks. Finally, common sense prevailed. The Dutch returned to their homes and let the soldiers continue their preparations. Fighting for the towns continued throughout the day. Thus, at the end of the first day of battle in Holland, the 101st was able to report the achievement of most of its objectives. Except for the capture of Eindhoven, all the towns and bridges had been taken. The unexpected German resistance at best was proving to be a thorn in the division's side, but this was considered a secondary objective, not part of the initial mission. In short, it could have been much worse, but the worst was yet to come. Further north along the corridor, the American 82nd Airborne Division and the British 1st Airborne Division were having their own serious problems with a determined enemy. The entire operation was behind schedule. Operation Market Garden. At first light, Lieutenant Wierzbowski, a platoon leader with the 101st Airborne Division, and his men had their first clear view of the bridge they had been assigned to seize. It was a tantalizing sight, so close yet so far away. The bridge wasn't much, as bridges often are, a single-span concrete structure a little over 30 meters long. But south of the bridge, he spotted a barracks with dug-in positions around it. These positions were packed with German soldiers. Whenever one of the soldiers became too visible, the Germans opened fire from both sides. Early that morning, the men saw a group of Germans approaching them from the trees along the north bank of the canal, stragglers from the 2nd Battalion's attack. The soldiers held their fire until the Germans were within 50 meters. Then they opened fire and riddled them with bullets, killing about 35. At about 10 in the morning, observers saw a German soldier and a civilian approach the other side of the bridge. They remained there for about 20 minutes, apparently doing nothing but chatting. They wanted to shoot the German, but thinking the civilian was Dutch, they held back for fear that a stray bullet might hit an Allied civilian. An hour later, there was a terrible explosion. The bridge shook and rose up. Debris of concrete and steel flew through the air and fell on the troops in their trenches. So the best bridge was gone, but Wierzbowski had no way of communicating this information to the regiment. Nevertheless, Wierzbowski and his men felt they had been sent on duty and would stay and do the best they could. As the day progressed and the situation worsened, they began to lose hope. In fact, unbeknownst to them, the regiment had already given them up for lost. Then their hopes were suddenly rekindled. Suddenly, a British armoured personnel carrier and a reconnaissance vehicle appeared across the canal. The Germans opened fire on them. The vehicles stopped at the corner of a building and began firing with all their machine guns. The Germans dug in around the barracks area, broke free and fled. By the end of the day, the 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions had secured most of their objectives. But they had failed to capture the crucial bridge over the Waal River at Nijmegen. The well-entrenched Waffen SS troops were making things very difficult for them. Only a heroic effort finally succeeded in taking the bridge. Crossing the Waal the next day, somewhat behind schedule, the armoured guard discovered that the Germans had used the extra time to establish defences along the rest of the route. Further advance was slow and costly. But that was not all. The British in Arnhem, at the top of the corridor, had been unlucky from the start. They landed in an area heavily populated by Germans. Their airborne supplies fell into enemy hands. Their men, north of the Niederrhein, failed to seize the bridge that would connect them to the south bank of the river. Without control of that bridge, the armored guard would never reach them. By the third day, the position was becoming desperate. The airborne landings in Holland did not entirely surprise the German High Command. Hitler and his generals knew that the Allies had large airborne forces ready for action, where they did not know. Assessing the overall situation, they analyzed Holland, but concluded that such an adventure was too risky for the Allies. Even so, when the first paratroopers began to descend, the German High Command understood the significance of what was happening and immediately began preparing countermeasures. Since the airborne troops had landed in the sector of the German 1st Parachute Army, its commander, Colonel General Kurt Student, was responsible for the immediate response. He subordinated all Luftwaffe units in the area to local commanders. Anti-aircraft units were formed into battle groups. New fortress battalions were added to the 1st Parachute Army. The German strategy for engaging Market Garden was to contain the corridor at its base and then cut it as quickly as possible near Eindhoven. If this were done after the armoured elements had moved north, the British Seacheck's Corps would be caught in a net and could be systematically destroyed. In any case, Hitler believed the line could be held at Nijmegen and the corridor cut thereafter. Not all German generals agreed. Some believed all bridges along the route should be destroyed and the German armies should retreat behind the Rhine to defend themselves. But Field Marshal Walter Model would hear no such thing. He had no doubt about the German ability to hold the key bridge at Arnhem. He had enough troops in the area and more on the way to prevent a Rhine crossing in force. Alert units of the 9th SS Panzer Division Hohenstaufen were in the area, along with those of the 10th SS Panzer Division Frundsberg. As long as the German armies remained there, at the top of the corridor, counterattacks would be launched along the entire corridor to try to cut the vital line. For the Screaming Eagles, the second phase of their Operation Market Garden was about to begin. On the morning of September 20th, the Germans swooped in and attacked Sun. They advanced in force against the 327th Regiment, which held a 400-yard front south of the Wilhelmina Canal. The outpost that raised the alarm was overrun, and the company commander, Captain William Miller, had to quickly move his men from one place to another to stop an immediate advance. Fortunately, the ground was flat, and 2 German tanks leading the assault were afraid of getting too close. The Germans then shifted their attack to the north of the canal, defended by the 1st Battalion of the 506th Regiment. This attack was also repulsed. An hour later, the Germans renewed their assault, this time with more infantry and 8 tanks. Fierce fighting ensued. The lines began to give way. More men were urgently needed. Suddenly, 10 British tanks appeared from Best. The 2 lead tanks were disabled after passing over an American minefield. The remaining 8 engaged the German tanks and destroyed 4 of them, losing 1 of their own. By mid-morning, a general German withdrawal had begun. A few kilometers to the north at Sint-Oedenrode, the Germans were also holding the 101st Division busy. Batteries of self-propelled guns and .88 caliber guns shelled the town sporadically, hampering movement. Under this intermittent fire, the 2nd and 3rd Battalions of the 502nd Regiment moved away from their positions at Best and into Sint-Oedenrode. At the same time, an advanced detachment was preparing an old castle in the town for use as a division command post. By 5:30 that afternoon, it was all over. With only minor casualties, the battalion had killed 40 Germans, wounded many more, and taken 418 prisoners. On the 5th day of Operation Market Garden, the German pressure on the 101st Division eased slightly. As many suspected, it was simply the lull before the storm. But the soldiers took advantage of this respite. During the first 3 days of the campaign, no wounded had been evacuated due to heavy traffic northward. However, on the 4th day, ambulances and trucks crossed the lines. On the 5th day, as the fighting subsided, these vehicles, loaded with the wounded, returned to an evacuation hospital in Belgium. General Taylor took steps to move some of his men north, while the British moved more men to the base of the corridor and took over some of the defensive positions. Taylor also wanted to widen the corridor as much as possible, keeping the Germans out of range of roadside artillery and making it more difficult for them to effect a complete cut. The blow the 101st Division had waited 2 days for fell that morning. A German attack cut the road between Veghel and Uden. When radioed to Kinnard and Ewell, the order came to repatriate all British tanks. They were needed elsewhere. The German encirclement south of Schindel could not continue as planned. The 4 battalions eventually abandoned the attack and headed for the corridor between Veghel and Sint-Oedenrode. Thus, a day that began with high hopes for a brilliant offensive became a day of desperate defense. The Germans likely chose Veghel as a point of attack because the destruction of the bridges over the AA River and the Zuid-Willems-Vaart Canal would halt traffic along the corridor long after the attackers had left. The Dutch resistance managed to warn the division that morning about the advance of large German forces toward the corridor at Veghel, but by then little could be done. The Germans had a convoy of 400 trucks advancing from the east, composed of panzers and the 280th Assault Gun Brigade. From the west, a large infantry force with 5 mobile guns was approaching along both banks of the canal, ready to attack. At around 9:30 a.m., the Germans launched a coordinated attack on Veghel from the southeast, north, and northwest. The largest battle to date in Holland began. As the assault began, the advance guard of the 1st Battalion, 506, was already moving toward Uden, north of Veghel. Aboard trucks, jeeps, and any other type of vehicle they could muster, the soldiers rushed north, commanded by Colonel Charles Chase, the regimental executive officer. They arrived in Uden at 11 a.m., just in time to be cut off and isolated by the Germans, who cut the road beneath them. Fortunately, the Germans were unaware that Colonel Chase had little more than a company of men, or they could have easily overwhelmed him. The colonel astutely redeployed his men throughout the town, creating the impression of a larger force. His deception worked. The Germans never attempted an all-out attack against him. At Veghel, General McAuliffe was in charge of the defense. He had arrived in the village that morning to scout for a new location for the division command post. When the attack broke out, General Taylor ordered him to stay and take control. Shortly after 11 o'clock, the men of the 2nd Battalion, 501st, spotted the tanks and infantry of the 107th Panzer Corps advancing along the road leading east to the town of Erp. The battle had begun. Considerably outnumbered and outgunned, the soldiers responded to the assault from trenches and houses on the outskirts. The first enemy wave attacked them. With bazookas and mortars, they stopped the tanks. When the infantry approached with their rifles, grenades, and machine guns, the soldiers held firm, poured all possible fire into the enemy, and repulsed the first wave. That was the most they could do at the moment. Desperate, they watched as part of the German column turned left toward the Uden road and cut it off. There was no one to stop them. Then the Germans turned around and attacked Veghel from the Uden road as well. The situation was becoming desperate when the 2nd Battalion, 506th Regiment, entered the town from the south. General McAuliffe quickly escorted them to the northern perimeter in time to engage the Germans coming up the Uden road. With the 2nd Battalion was a group from the 81st Airborne Anti-Aircraft Battalion towing their 57mm guns, useful as anti-tank weapons. Seeing Colonel Cox, commander of the 81st Regiment, General McAuliffe shouted to him, "Get one of your guns up that road and take out a tank. That might stop them." Colonel Cox climbed into the nearest gun-towing jeep and told the driver to move. In the jeep were Captain Adolph Guimard, Corporal William Bowyer, and Private First Class Rogie Roberts. Together, they ran down the Uden road toward the sound of the gunfire. A sad sight greeted them. A German Mark 55 Panther tank was straddling the road, firing at a British anti-aircraft unit that had been caught en route as the attack began. This unit was equipped only with 37mm guns. Oddly enough, when Colonel Cox arrived on the scene, there was a 37mm gun, piloted by an American crew from the 327th, dueling with the German tank. No one knew how they got there, mixed up with the British, but there they were, and their duel was brave but futile. Firing 37mm shells at a German Panther was as futile as throwing rocks at it. Colonel Cox wasted no time seeking cover. He and his crew turned their 57 into the middle of the road, about 100 yards from the tank. The Germans spotted them and fired. The crew saw the muzzle flash, but luckily the shell passed over their heads and hit a house behind them, causing a shower of masonry. Calmly, Colonel Cox looked through the gun sight, aimed and fired. The shot knocked some tracks off the tank, destroying it. His second quick shot set it ablaze. That setback for the moment weakened the German attack, but they didn't stop. They circled the 2nd Battalion on the left, continuing the pressure in a northern arc around Veghel. More help was needed, and fast. The 327th was on its way, but because the corridor in their area remained clogged with heavy northbound British traffic, the gliders were forced onto secondary roads. This slowed their march. When Colonel Harper and his 327th Regiment reached Saint-Côme-du-Mont Road, they knew the attack on Veghel was underway and the situation was dire. Gathering all possible motorized transport, Colonel Harper loaded his mortars, anti-tank guns, heavy machine guns, 2 companies of the 3rd Battalion, and another battery of the 81st Anti-Aircraft Battalion, and headed north along the main road toward Veghel. They arrived around 1 p.m. and immediately took up defensive positions on the left flank of the 2nd Battalion, 506th. Together, the two groups successfully repelled the Germans and opened a gap in the road. An hour later, the Germans attacked from the west, advancing against the highway bridge over the canal. With their mobile heavy artillery, they cleared the bridge area. General McAuliffe and Colonel Sink rushed to see what could be done. Along the way, they encountered Company D of the 506th heading toward Uden, unaware that the road was closed. They turned the company around and took it with them to the bridge area. Just as this unit arrived, a group of Sherman tanks approached noisily from the south, heading straight for the bridge. The tankers were unaware that the German guns had it completely covered. If they reached the bridge, they would be easy prey. There was only one way to stop them, and Colonel Sink succeeded. He ran across the bridge amid a hail of small arms fire and stopped the tanks in time. The presence of the tanks, the fresh troops, and the stubborn defense of the bridge discouraged the Germans. They broke off the attack and then turned south to cut the road between Veghel and Saint-Côme-du-Mont Road, which would complete the encirclement of Veghel. But just as they were cutting the road, the rest of the 327th Glider and 321st Artillery came marching up the road from Saint-Côme-du-Mont Road. Quickly, Companies A and C deployed and advanced against the German right flank, firing as they went. The Germans scattered and headed west, back across the canal. The 2 assault companies continued advancing until the road was clear and joined the men fighting on the vital bridge. 70 prisoners were rounded up. The road south was again open. The bridge was momentarily safe from enemy attack. Throughout the day and well into the night, the Germans attacked, were defeated, re-advanced, and were repulsed again. The town of Veghel was constantly bombarded by artillery. The Dutch civilians, so exultant over their liberation several days earlier, were now huddled in their cellars, praying that something of their small town would be left standing when the battle was over. Meanwhile, the soldiers were stranded in Uden. Where the Germans had cut the road north of Veghel, they had wreaked havoc on everything they found along it. Burning British vehicles of all types littered the highway. Dozens of trucks loaded with vital supplies for the troops in Nijmegen and Arnhem were looted or destroyed. Cutting the highway was like severing an artery leading to the heart of Operation Market Garden. The road to the north would have to be opened. The Germans would have to be denied the 2 vital bridges over the canal. The next morning, the Germans attacked again from the south and west, attempting to take the canal bridge. They were stopped again. Then the paratroopers of the 101st Division counterattacked. 2 battalions of the 506th advanced north along the road toward Uden. In the face of their determined attack, the Germans melted away. The soldiers advanced more than a mile along the road. There they encountered advance elements of the British Grenadier Guards, moving down from the north. The road was clear. The men at Uden were safe. With the corridor clear, the soldiers turned their attention to the Germans west and southeast of Veghel. They attacked the enemy concentrations at both points and drove them back. However, the battle was not over. For 4 more days, it wavered. From the northwest, a powerful German force, including SS units, arrived with the objective of once again cutting the road between Veghel and Saint-Côme-du-Mont Road, near the town of Köfring. In the sand dunes near the town of Erde, the pride of the German Wehrmacht faced troops from the 501st Regiment and were defeated. But a small group, about 200 men and a few tanks, slipped away from the battlefield, found an unprotected road, and attacked Köfring. They reached a British convoy, disabled 3 tanks, burned all the trucks and cut the road at that point. The corridor was once again blocked. For the next 24 hours, this small but sturdy German force defended the road against the counterattack. The fighting was reduced to tank against tank, man against man. Units of the 502nd Regiment, the 506th Regiment, and the British Royal Guard cornered the Germans and began to press them. By nightfall the next day, the remnants of the German force slipped away to the northwest. Behind them, they left a road so heavily mined that the 326th Regiment's engineers had to work another half-day at great risk to clear the way for traffic. It wasn't until the 11th day of Operation Market Garden that the soldiers of the 101st could breathe deeply and believe that, at least for the moment, their side of the battle was won. Traffic on their side of the corridor was fluid. Even mail arrived from England. Some men obtained passes to Brussels. Some men in the 101st believed the Screaming Eagles would be relieved and sent back to England. The campaign had already dragged on for many more days than expected. After all, the Eagles were a striking force unit, not a common infantry division. But their days in Holland were far from over. While they fought around Veghel to keep the lifeline open, what happened in the north determined their fate for the next 2 months. From day 3, when the Nijmegen Bridge was taken, the British 46th Corps had tried to force a route north from the Waal River to the Neder Rhin, but rain prevented tanks from getting through. The British advance was costly and slow. Finally, on the 5th, a group of light armoured vehicles managed to break away and make a sideways run toward Driel, on the south bank of the river, not far from Arnhem. There they joined forces with a group of Polish paratroopers who had been deployed there. On the north bank of the river in Arnhem lay the British 1st Airborne Division, completely surrounded by an overwhelming force of Germans. Day by day the encirclement closed, and brave men died in fierce and bloody fighting, until the remnants of the division were confined to a small area just west of Arnhem and north of the river. The continued resistance of the British in a desperate situation endures in history as one of the most heroic and tragic episodes of the war. On D-Day +8, under cover of night, the survivors were forced back across the river, under the constant threat of total annihilation. Of the 10,095 men who marched or joined the battle, 2,490 returned across the river. The British, in effect, had attempted to venture a bridge too far. The Allied High Command abandoned the idea of reaching the Zuider Zee. It was accepted that the south bank of the Lower Rhine would be the northern limit of Operation Market Garden. Indeed, the operation, as planned, was a failure. It did not achieve what it had set out to do. The Allied troops had not crossed the Rhine. The Siegfried Line was not outflanked. Still, on the positive side, it could honestly be said that the operation had liberated large areas of Holland and advanced the northern flank of the Allied forces 96 kilometers. Undoubtedly, the soldiers of the 101st had done their part. They had seized and held their part of the corridor for much longer than initially anticipated, but not without cost. During the first 11 days of the campaign, the division had 373 men killed, 1,436 wounded, and 547 missing in action. But the 101st could not be called upon to rest. The British, weakened by the disaster at Arnhem, needed help holding the new front line along the Lower Rhine. When the situation in the southern part of the corridor stabilized, the 101st Division was sent north to take over a defense line that stretched east to west for 10 miles from the town of Ofiersten. There, on that stretch of flat, wet ground that came to be known as the Island, the division spent 2 more months. From the north bank of the river, where the terrain was rugged, German artillery could directly see the soldiers in the gorge. Any movement during daylight was dangerous. Supply vehicles faced endless shell fire to reach the front. It was almost like the terrible trench warfare of World War I. Trenches filling with water, poor food, constant sniping, shelling, deaths. A war of attrition. Here, the soldiers first encountered the new German multi-barreled mortars, which screeched shrilly as they launched their shells into the sky. In early October, during a German attack, Colonel Johnson was killed by an artillery shell. Of the regiment's original commanders, only Colonel Sink remained. General Taylor also nearly died on the Island. On November 9th, he was wounded by a mortar shell. For the men of the 101st, the grey and dangerous days seemed endless. They went on patrol, cursing the German artillery, the cold, the damp. They couldn't believe they would remain there through the winter. Their morale was slowly dwindling, their numbers were slowly dwindling, eroding under the merciless abrasion of the German artillery and the incessant snipers. Finally, in mid-November, the relief began. Unit after unit, the division was pulled from the line in Holland and sent to Mourmelon-le-Grand, near the city of Reims, France. There, in what had once been a French artillery garrison, the division was to rest, re-equip, train replacements, and await the next call to action. As the advance parties moved toward Mourmelon-le-Grand, fate once again played out the fate of the 101st Airborne Division. Once again, its numbers would be strained, for in an underground bunker in East Prussia, deep in a dark forest, Hitler and his generals were finalizing a plan that would force the soldiers to abandon their comfortable garrison too soon. A tremendous offensive was being prepared in Belgium, where its code name was Wacht am Rhein, or Watch on the Rhine.